Thank you for joining this Magical History Tour presentation. I'm Laurel Westendorf, part of the Community Relations team at the Deschutes Public Library. Every month we explore a theme, and this month we're exploring sci-fi and fantasy from the real to the imagined and historical. Our presenter is Martha Bayless, a medievalist who specializes in the popular culture of the Middle Ages. She has a Ph.D. from Cambridge University and is professor of English and director of folklore and public culture at the University of Oregon. Thank you so much, Martha, for sharing the historical traditions of magic with us.
Sure. Hello. Today I'm going to talk about 5 surprising things in the history of magic. And these 5 magical things are shoes, fairies, Santa, trick-or-treating, and last, witches and their cats. To start with shoes. Your shoes are magical. If you live in a house built before about 1900 in either the US or Britain or in many parts of Europe, chances are there's a shoe built into your house, a magic shoe. So what about shoes is magic? Take this example. In the early 1980s, workers started to renovate a building in Washington, D.C., which was to become the National Building Museum. They found shoes concealed under the floors of the rooms. This is their webpage, and that's one of the shoes. Women's shoes, fancy shoes, common shoes, worn shoes, new shoes. Always only one shoe under the floor of each room, no pairs. Why were there shoes concealed all over that house, and maybe all over your house? Well, according to medieval thought, there's something magical about shoes that attracts beings who want to put them on. That was how, in fact, you supposedly caught a monkey. You go out to the wilderness where monkeys live and leave out a shoe. The monkey sees the shoe and can't resist putting it on. And while he's doing that, you sneak up on the monkey. Pretty sure it works, maybe. But who you will catch with the shoe depends on where you put the shoe. If you put a shoe in the wilderness, you might catch a monkey. But if you put a shoe in a wall, who's going to find that shoe? Obviously, someone who's trying to pass through the wall of your house. Obviously, evil spirits. The medieval explanation for bad luck is that evil spirits, demons, had gotten in, so you had to stop them with the supernatural power of magically attracting shoes. The person who set the first example of stopping demons with shoe power was a man named John Shorn. He was a legendary English exorcist from the 15th century who trapped the devil in a boot. You can see him here holding his boot. And the devil is that little thing with wings that's kind of sticking out the top. The name Shorn is very close to the Old English and German words for shoes, so even John Shorn's name has shoes in it. Since then, shoes have been concealed in thousands of buildings. The oldest known concealed shoe was found behind the choir stalls of Winchester Cathedral in England, which were put in 1308. There are so many shoes concealed in buildings that there's even a museum with a vast collection of shoes found in walls. The Northampton Museum in Northampton, England, which has a concealed shoes index of 3,000 shoes, plus 250 actual found shoes dating back to the 1540s. These shoes on the screen right now are actually shoes from East Anglia. Concealing shoes in houses was also common in the United States. In the walls of the birthplace of John Adams, the second president of the US, in Braintree, Massachusetts, they found 44 concealed shoes, which is a record. Here's a page from the Westport Historical Society in Massachusetts with their collection of concealed shoes. We also have a formerly concealed shoe here at the Museum of Natural and Cultural History at the University of Oregon, but they wouldn't let me take it away to show you. Maybe they think I'd let the evil spirits escape. But whereas you want to keep demons out of your walls, you have a different aim at weddings. Traditionally, the wish at weddings is for the couple to be fertile and produce a healthy family. Hence, traditionally at weddings, shoes are either thrown after the couple or attached to the car. These shoes are meant to magically attract babies. This is a close-up of a painting called For Better, For Worse. The couple has just gotten married, and you can see the shoes have already been thrown after them down there on the ground with a circle on them. And some more people are waiting to throw shoes over there with a circle around them. A similar theme that shoes attract babies is behind the rhyme about the old woman who lived in a shoe. You'll remember there was an old woman who lived in a shoe. She had so many children, she didn't know what to do. So if shoes magically attract the kind of being appropriate to that place, does that mean That horseshoes hung on a barn attract horses? You be the judge. Speaking of magical beings, let's discuss fairies and elves. The truth is, fairies are elves, elves are fairies. We're used to thinking of elves and fairies as two distinct types of magical beings. Elves are currently most famous probably from The Lord of the Rings or maybe from Dungeons and Dragons. They often wear green. They always seem to have pointy ears, which they show conspicuously on every occasion to clear up any doubt about whether you were seeing an elf. Apparently, it's against the elf code to wear your hair covering your pointy ears. By contrast, fairies are currently seen as kind of floaty beings, often female and wearing pink and dancing in circles. Sometimes they have wings like Tinkerbell. Especially in older sources, they used to be regarded as human-sized, but as time has passed, they're depicted as smaller and smaller. Sometimes now they're depicted as so small that they're almost microscopic. But historically, elves and fairies were the same thing. The word elf was the English word for them. The French equivalent was taken from the Latin fata, derived from the goddesses known as the Fates. Fata was shortened to Fae, and the world of the beings was known as Faerie, and then Faerie started to be used for the magical beings themselves. The French word fairy wasn't used in England until the 1400s, very late in medieval history. We can see the two terms are the same in a poem from perhaps the 17th century, "Come follow me, you fairy elves that be, which circle on the green. Come follow Mab, your queen. Hand in hand, let's dance around, for this place is fairy ground. And mortals are at rest and snoring in their nest, unheard and unespied. Through keyholes we do glide, over tables, stools, and shelves. We trip it with our fairy elves." You can also see it in 1438, when a woman named Alice Hancock was charged with claiming that she could heal boys who were afflicted by the spirits of the air, which the common people call fairy. Now the question is, what do they mean by the spirits of the air? Do they mean fairies can fly? This would be very early for fairies to be able to fly. They would be confused with angels at that period. Or do they mean they're made out of air, they're insubstantial, or that they're invisible? We don't know. But what does it all come down to? Historically, it comes down to the fact that there was no difference between elves and fairies, and neither of them had pointy ears. So medieval fairy elves were not originally tiny, but other magical beings are tiny. Oh, there's a fairy being very beautiful. Santa is tiny. This is the magical being that we still have going strong in the US. Santa Claus, in fact, is a tiny miniature being. Let's look at one of our earliest sources, Clement Moore's poem, A Visit from St. Nicholas, usually known as The Night Before Christmas. Once we get into the poem, we see Santa, and it says, "When what to my wondering eyes should appear but a miniature sleigh and 8 tiny reindeer, with a little old driver so lively and quick, I knew in a moment he must be St. Nick. His droll little mouth was drawn up like a bow. He had a broad face and a little round belly that shook when he laughed like a bowl full of jelly. He was chubby and plump, a right jolly old elf." And you can see in these pictures that he's actually small. He's small like an elf. That's how he's able to get down through the chimney, which is something that I always worried about when I was a kid. Traditionally, many people believed in a whole host of tiny household spirits. Here are some from the Middle Ages: pixies, brownies, hobs, kobolds, sprites, boggarts, buttocks, dobbies, tomtoos, nisses. They all lived in your house. They might be good, they might be bad, they might punish you if you didn't do good things, and the householders leave gifts for them, such as bowls of milk. So St. Nicholas was understood as miniature like these creatures throughout most of the 19th century, as the illustrations make clear. He was a combination of the St. Nicholas, who was the 3rd century Bishop of Myra, and a gift-giving household sprite. Both of them gave gifts, and he became basically our household sprite. Where the British had pixies and the Swedes had tomtes, the Americans have Santa. So how did Santa Claus get big again? When adults started to impersonate Santa, they had to be big because adults are adult size. And so in malls and in front of grocery stores, when you have people who aren't, of course, the real Santa, they're just people pretending to be the real Santa, they're adults, and so they have to be big. But even if we've forgotten how small Santa is supposed to be, we still leave him milk, just as we used to do for many other little folk. But let's leave Christmas and backtrack to that magical October holiday, Halloween. Modern Halloween is associated with candy, costumes, trick-or-treating, and probably ghosts and witches. But that's not how it all started. Halloween started with the medieval Christian holidays of All Souls' Day and All Saints' Day, which are November 1st and 2nd. And of course, they're evenings before, like Christmas Eve is the night before Christmas. So All Souls' Eve is the night before All Souls. These are holidays in which people honor the saints and pray for the souls of the dead. If you're familiar with the Mexican tradition, or if you've seen the movie Coco, you'll recognize that Mexico has a similar holiday for the souls of the dead. And All Souls and All Saints were religious holidays celebrated all over Europe. We can see this in the etymology. The word hallow means holy, and so the two holidays together are called Hallowtide. And another word for All Hallows Eve was Hallow Eve or Halloween. People naturally worried about their loved ones who had died, and there was a belief that on All Souls' Day or All Souls' Eve, the wall between the living and the dead was not so strong, and the dead could receive prayers and comfort. Sometimes they believed that the dead could visit our world again briefly on that night. They also believed that the dead could hear the church bells rung for them on that day. This was so strong a belief that in the 16th century, when England declared this a silly superstition and forbade the ringing of church bells, people frantically tried to rush the churches and ring the bells anyway, desperate to keep their dead loved ones from thinking they were forgotten. In the Middle Ages, communion wafers, the Eucharist, was thought to be so powerful that it could literally work magic. So people would try to steal the wafers from churches. The church, predictably, disapproved of this. So a tradition started up of people making similar wafers at home. And these are small and round, like church wafers, but they were called soul cakes. So on All Hallows Eve, people went door to door saying a little formula or rhyme and receiving soul cakes. For every one that was made and eaten, a soul was supposed to be saved in the afterlife. Over time, as sugar and fruit became cheaper and more available, sometimes these soul cakes became sweetened. Soul cakes on All Souls' Eve are still a tradition in parts of Europe. But when Europeans migrated to the United States, the tradition became to go from door to door getting candy, which is the ultra-sweetened version of soul cakes. So Halloween has always been a magical holiday, but it's not, as many people think, a pagan magical holiday. It has always been a Christian magical holiday, using Christian supernatural power against the forces of darkness. Now here you may say, but what about the Druids? You may say, I heard that Halloween was invented by Druids who performed horrific rites. This is what they call fake news. The Druids were Celtic pre-Christian priests and had died out many centuries before Halloween started up, and nothing they did was related to Halloween in any way. This rumor is the result of some badly informed early writers who were basically guessing that all old stuff must be connected. Well, what about witches? They're medieval, they're women, they ride broomsticks, they wear pointy black hats, and they have cats, right? The answer to this is not so fast. First, witches are not really very medieval as a category. The Middle Ages was full of people who tried to use magic, but people who specialized in magic were usually called cunning women or cunning men or wise men. You may remember in the story of Christmas, the Magi, the three wise men, are proceeding to see the infant Jesus. Wise men is the medieval term for magicians. In fact, the word magi comes from the word magic. The three wise men were three magicians. That's how they knew to follow the star. So magicians were not called witches in most of the Middle Ages. They were called cunning men, cunning women, or wise men. But as for witches and a worry that there were magicians doing evil, the Middle Ages lasted from around 500 to around 1500, and the witch hunts and witch trials only really started to gain pace in the 1400s. That's the last 100 years of a 1,000-year period. And so here's a chart that shows very clearly that people really started to worry about witches and identify people as witches only around 1550 in the so-called Renaissance, which has a lot of explaining to do. Why people started to worry about witches so much is a complex question, but the simple answer is that conditions made people look for someone to blame, and influential churchmen pinpointed certain kinds of people, especially but not always women, as the ones to blame. Witch hunts belong to the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. If you think about the famous American example, the Salem witch trials, those took place in the 1600s, not medieval at all. So witches were mostly not medieval. Were they women? Around 3/4 of the people accused of witchcraft were women, but 1/4 were men. But they wore pointy black hats, didn't they? No, the idea of pointy black hats came in the 1700s, which is where these two pictures are from, just as people started to lose interest in witches. So you see that they are wearing pointy black hats, but there's some other unexpected bits here, like the man on the very right is a man flying on a broomstick, which you rarely hear about these days, as well as there being a devil flying on a broomstick. So did they ride broomsticks? Yes, witches were thought to ride broomsticks. And here are two actual genuine medieval supposed witches riding broomsticks. You can see they just have normal hats on, sort of wimples, but they are on broomsticks. You can straddle broomsticks, and everybody has a broomstick in their house, so it was very handy. But I should say that you weren't supposed to be able to just ride a broomstick anytime you wanted. You had to rub it with a magic ointment first. But what about cats? Witches had cats, didn't they? Well, cats were supposed to be witches' familiars, in other words, demons in animal form, which would go and do evil on their behalf. But witches were said to have many other kinds of familiars too. In modern stories about witches, you never hear that they have dog familiars. I think to us, dogs are too bouncy and cheerful to seem like they'd make good demons. But during the period in which people were anxious about witches, they did have stories of dog familiars, as well as many other kinds: flies, toads, mice, rats, moles, wasps, spiders, and even snails. This woman has some kind of lizardy thing in a box as her familiars. She's feeding them heaven knows what. One woman named Alice Wright from Hitchin in Suffolk in England was accused of having 4 familiars. 2 were little boys, one was a buzzard, and one was a lamb. The most interesting thing about familiars, I think, is the names they're given. You can see some of them in this picture, where the woman over on the right is saying, "My imps' names are," and listing them. Like there's Pyewacket, Grizzle Greedyguts, Peck in the Crown, and there's Jamara, who looks like a dog, and Sack and Sugar seems to be a rabbit, Vinegar Tom. They're basically pets' names. A woman named Joan Rolsover from Polstead in Suffolk said she found 3 magic chicken familiars in a bush, and they turned into talking mice, which she named Touch, Pluck, and Take. A woman named Elizabeth Deeks from Rattlesden in Suffolk had a mouse familiar, which she strangely enough called Birds. But this just goes to show that people accused of witchcraft had all kinds of things that we wouldn't expect. And perhaps the most extreme of these is a man named John Bysack from 1645. John Bysack had 6 assassin snails as his familiars. And as you can see, they list the names of the snails here: Sidrake, Geoffrey, Peter, Aylward, Sekar, and Pieman. And I'm afraid I think this is hilarious. Geoffrey, the evil snail. Presumably the snails transform themselves into actual demons before going out to do mischief, because it's hard to imagine snails being very effective in snail form. You'd say, "Geoffrey, go harm the woman down the road." The snail would start off dutifully, and by the time it got down the road 10 years later, the woman would have moved away. Incidentally, I should add that I don't believe that anybody actually had familiars. Some of these people may have had pets with these names, others were just making it up or were delusional. They did not really send evil magical snails out in the fields to do harm. In fact, witches, as we think of them today, never did exist, People just thought they did. People tried to do magic, but they tried to do it in much more predictable ways than sending evil snails out to assassinate people. So what does this all mean? It means that some of our traditions are very old, like witches riding broomsticks and having cats, but also that the whole history of magic is a combination of the very familiar and the very surprising. There's always something to learn. So I'm going to stop and say thanks, and thanks for listening, and stay away from snails.
That is amazing. That there would be that many. It's funny when you think about like Halloween and how it's just like normal. But it has. I realized that I didn't really know where the history of trick-or-treating even came from until just now. I didn't expect to be so surprised this entire time, this entire presentation.
Oh, I'm glad you were surprised. It is strange when you think, how could that have developed, that people go from door to door getting candy? There has to have been a good incentive for people to hand out the candy.
Right.
But, there was at the time, which is that you were actually saving souls. And then it became a tradition like all these other things where you think, well, why should we stop it? It works. And so you just keep going, even if you don't believe it does something magical, you just keep going.
Right. It's like, oh, well, where's the shoe? We need to put it in the wall. It's like, now I really want to check out the concealed shoe index of all these shoes.
The shoe index is fun, and I belong to an old house site on Facebook, and Americans find shoes in their walls every week. There's so many of them. Yeah, so many of them.
No, I bet probably more prevalent on the East Coast, but still here too a little bit.
Yeah, you would think so, but actually it's all across the country. People had thought it was more prevalent on the East Coast, but you do find them in other places in the West. Yeah.
Especially, here in Bend, we have like some old houses, but they're mostly from like the 1900, like early 1900s, 1920s.
Yeah. So it's less likely, but it's not too late. So
we can still find them.
Well, you can still put them in.
Right. Because we need to protect ourselves. Is the thought that the ghosts will like come to the wall and then stop there? Or like the spirits? They'll come to the wall and be like, oh, I won't go any further because there's some nice shoes here.
Well, I think that, no, the demons, they start to go through the wall and then they see a shoe and they say, I must put this on. And then they get stuck in the shoe. So there's something about shoes that kind of sticks. They can't bear to take the shoe off. And so they're stuck in there in the shoe. Okay. And presumably you can fit several demons at one time because you only need one shoe per room. So demons, can overlap in the shoes, except in John Adams' house. I guess he needed 44 shoes.
Yeah. He must have been really worried about those demons.
I know. I was an unappreciated aspect to John Adams.
Right? Especially, after watching Hamilton, it's like, maybe he needed some extra help.
That's Hamilton, the sequel. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
The shoes.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all of this information about, Tiny Santa. Didn't know that, even though I've read that book like every year. Yeah, thanks, Martha.
Yeah, my pleasure.